Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today on What If Process is Your Problem? Joining us today is Bob Beaird from Innovia Consulting, and we're excited to have such a fantastic turnout today. And before I pass it, before I pass it over to Bob to cover on this hot topic, I would like to remind you that this session is being recorded, and it will be posted to our on-demand library later this week for you to review and share with anyone. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box, and we will get them answered during our Q&A time at the end of our session. And so now I will pass it on to Bob to kick off our presentation.
Great, thanks, Angie. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending. This is a session, actually, I've given it summit a couple of times, going to do it this coming summit and at various regional NAVIC sessions. So I'm always surprised, geez, hasn't everybody seen this? But glad we've got a good group of attendees. And as Angie said, we certainly welcome any questions you want to type in, and we'll try and answer them at the end. So the session's entitled, What If Process is Your Problem? And I always like to say, you know, in most business processes where there's issues, that's where the problem is, right? It is something in the process. It might be system disconnects, whatever. One thing I always like to say when I've run process redesign sessions is, sure, people are part of the problem, but as Duran, who was one of Deming's people with Deming, who came up with quality control systems and everything, used to say 85% of the problem is the process. People issues, you know, you just deal with as people issues. So the answer to that is process your problem? The answer is yes, right? If you're having trouble with any of your business functions. So my name is Bob Beaird. That's actually a picture of me in New Braunfels, Texas. Oh no, that's actually a picture of me on vacation in Tulum, Mexico. So I don't want to be there right now, but I'd like to be there in February. And just a quick piece of background on me. I work with Innovia in customer engagement. So I work with clients kind of as a senior advisor. I also do project work like process redesign and help people select other software to work with NAV and BC. And in the past, I've run a management consulting group and technology consulting group, and basically been doing process work for well over 20 years right now. So what are we trying to accomplish in this session? Want to explore mapping techniques. There's really two techniques we, Innovia as a practice, uses. Explore those and how they can be used. And then get an overview of the process for running value stream mapping sessions. So kind of the process for the process. And then hopefully you leave with an understanding of value stream mapping and some thoughts about how and where you can apply those tools in your business. So the agenda follows logically from those objectives. We're going to talk about some mapping styles, how you query the process. So when you're in looking at a process, what do you ask about it? How do you explore it? That kind of thing. And then the process for the process, as I mentioned, you know, so how do you run sessions? What are some of the outcomes from the sessions? And then, like I said, we'll hopefully have some time for some questions. So let's talk about mapping styles. And I said there's two primary alternatives, but I always start with the baseline because people are very familiar with this. And one of the two styles incorporates elements of this. The other style doesn't. And that's your standard flowchart map. I'm sure a lot of the people listening have used it. When I ask for people to raise their hands, most people have said, yeah, I've done that. A flowchart will have a starting point, an ending point. You'll have task boxes, activity boxes, decision diamonds, alternative branches off of those decision diamonds. It's great for mapping out logic flow, but not for defining a cross-functional business process. You know, here's the picture. It's the old familiar flowchart. You know, looking at this, you can see the decision boxes. Is the invoice paid or not? You don't see anything in here about who's doing what, etc. It's really kind of detailed logic flow, and that's where it's useful. But elements of this technique, like I said, are incorporated in one of the two mapping styles. So let's talk about those two mapping styles that we use. And really our decision on how to use them is a little dependent on the consultant who's doing the work and a little dependent on what we're trying to get at. So what we're calling swim lane map 1, and you'll see visually, I'm going to refer to this kind of as the vertical swim lane as opposed to the horizontal swim lane. In this map, and you'll see an example in a minute, we define the activity, so what happens in each step, who does it, so what departments or personnel are involved in the activity, the tasks, so underneath the activity there's tasks, what's being completed during this activity, what happens when an activity is completed, what system, and systems is broadly defined, so that can be computer or manual systems, right? And then, of course, record how much, if we can, record how much time it takes on average to complete the activity. Of the two styles, my feeling is this is better for detailing the logic behind activities and the logic behind what you're doing. So, you know, kind of what I'd say is if you want to look at more in detail how you're using NAV and how, or BC, I should get used to saying BC, are you using NAV and BC, and what can be done, what happens behind the scene, what can be done to make your use more efficient, what modifications you might want to make, etc. This is a little better style. I'm hoping everybody can see this on the screen, so you can see where I'm saying vertical. So the yellow on the left says activity. So if you go across, the activities here are things like create order, then create sales order header, and create line items. So in the other style, you won't see things broken down typically into this level of detail. That's why I think this is better when you're really trying to dig into what's happening specifically in the system. In the who, you see, so create order who, you see all of the functions that create orders, sales reps, customer service, etc. So this is good for detailing who's doing this particular activity, but it doesn't necessarily break out as the other style does. You don't see cleanly what every function's doing, right? You have to kind of look across and see, well, what are sales reps doing, etc. What's EDI? You see detail in the tasks, so uploading an external order to NAV, creating the sales order header, that this comes in EDI, fax, emails, orders come in. You see down the next yellow box below talks about what happens when a task is complete. And so if you look at the second blue column, you'll see the task is complete when the header is validated, right? And then system, and in this particular case, all these are from thinly disguised customers that we've worked with. In this case, there were two systems. They had a custom designed iPad tablet order entry system, and they were entering things in NAV. So there's actually two systems in play. You don't see the time documented here, but again, each one of these activities could have time documented in order to record what kind of time savings, what kind of time, you know, is excessive time being used, how much resource, how much time is being used to accomplish these activities. So that's swim lane 1. Swim lane 2, which I'll refer to as the horizontal swim lanes, uses flowchart system. So you get a little more of the logic of the process, all right? It's just makes it more evident, the overall business process. Tasks are actions that are completed in the process, and typically, this is a style I've used most in my career. Typically, you don't break things down into create an order header, create order lines. It's more create order, right? So it's more, the tasks are more actions that are completed in the process and orders created. Functional bands, which you'll see to show who's doing what. It includes external functional bands, not the other example can certainly identify external sources, but it's just important to note that external sources like customer and suppliers should also be documented in this. And you can include, although it's not as evident, time for each task and time frames for groups of tasks. You can, this also includes some kind of coding. You can use some coding for the systems involved. I'll show that this will come clearer when you see the example. And comments for the task details. So you can use comments. Any of that, this is all through Visio. Both of these are through Visio. So as you know, you can add comments to a task, etc., and you can color code things. As I said, this is better for capturing the overall process logic flow and the functional handoffs. And I think you'll see that with the example. So here is an example of the swim lane 2, and you can see why I'm calling it horizontal. So you can see the functional band supplier. So there's an external functional band. Purchasing, sales, planning, in this case, that was the planning function at the client, and logistics. You can see color coding down at the bottom. So there's a color coding for blue is nav, so anything in a blue box is accomplished in nav, and they had external WMS system. So the kind of pinkish reddish boxes are WMS. Anything that's not is manual, right? And if you look at the sales functional band and see sales demand, you're going to see a little note off there and a number 6. That's actually coded to the findings. And I'll explain that a little more. But again, this is an example of how you can use some of the capabilities of Visio to add comments in. If you look up at the top, the supplier band line, when it says analyze volume pricing tier, that activity, there's a note about review with pricing charts on the desktop, and then there's 3 numbers again, which go to the findings document, which link to a findings document. So I think you can see the difference between these two. Both are perfectly valid ways of doing it. Oh, by the way, you can also see the decision box in here. So the alternative paths, was it a custom item? If it is, you go this way. If it's not, you skip a task. That's harder to do in the previous example. And this is just an example of future state. And I'm going to point out the thing in red under sales, where it says in the future state, sales demand, current orders, and forecasts. So one of the things with this particular client is, and the little note, I'm going back to the previous slide, the little note number 6 said there was no formal way to really gather sales demand. It was basically kind of, just knowledge, communication, talking about things, a lot of new products introduced, et cetera. There was no formal demand management or forecasting plan. So that 6 note on our findings document said, this is a problem. And the recommendation was in future was to do a demand management system. We couldn't map out how a whole demand management system worked. That's a separate project. But the future state map here, again, shows sales demand, current orders plus forecasts. So there's going to be a forecast system in place. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a feel about the styles. Like I said, either of them can be used. The purpose remains the same. What we want to do is diagram how value is currently delivered. And then as we go along, identify where waste occurs. And I'll talk to you about that when we talk about the process for the process, basically. Identify areas of improvement leading to a diagram of how value should be delivered, the future state. And I gave you a little glimpse of that in that red box where it said, we're going to introduce in the future a forecasting system, some sort of demand management system. So So when you're going along in a process session, what questions do you ask? What do you look for when you're mapping the current state? So one of the things sometimes people are surprised we say is, question isn't always, how do you do this more efficiently? It's why are you even doing it? And my personal favorite example is when I was working actually with a major housing development authority. Every state has one of these. It's for low cost housing. They deal in billions of dollars of loans. And it was for their loan approval process. And one of the things that came along was there was one thing when we were talking about it where one of the forms in the loan approval went to an attorney, and everybody on the team said, and it gets stuck at that attorney. He travels a lot, and it often sits on his desk for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. Now, that attorney or anybody from his staff wasn't in the team. So I assigned the team for the next session to come back and ask him, what was going on, and was there any way they could short circuit that? Well, when they came back, they said, the attorney doesn't understand why he has to sign off on these loan forms. There's no legal reason. So they eliminated a 3-week delay in the loan approval process just by asking, why are you even doing this, right? And there's lots of other examples. Sometimes it's old desires to, you didn't trust an old system to look through every order manually. I've had a customer service that insisted that they had to look through every order manually, even though most orders were running through EDI flawlessly. So, ask, should we even be doing this? The more obvious things to ask are, what are the non-value added activity? I suppose, the examples I just gave are clearly non-value added activities, but that's why you want to highlight things that are important to do and things aren't, where we're not really adding any value. And then start to identify and prioritize the issues as you highlight issues and record issues on a flip chart and possible actions. We'll talk about this in the finding. We divide actions into 3 categories: do its, events, and projects. I'll explain what that means later. So questions to ask when you're doing this. Does this task really enable any competitive advantage? Does it reduce the price? Does it provide faster delivery, create fewer defects? If not, it may still be a necessary task, but just consider, how necessary it is. If the customer knew we were doing this, would they ask us just stop doing that? And if you can lower the price or deliver faster? Can I eliminate or reduce this activity, reduce the amount that I have to do this activity? I'll go back to the customer service manager who wanted to look over every EDI order even after they've been reviewed. Might be a few customers where maybe EDI isn't working right and you need to do that, but don't do it for every order, so can you reduce it? And really, more importantly, are there ways to make the activity in this process more efficient and accurate overall? That's, again, as you're doing the current state, questions you're going to ask. When in doubt about is this waste or not, look at the situation from the end user's perspective, and that means the external customer's perspective, certainly, but also the internal customer's perspective. So if you're entering an order, your internal customers are scheduling for manufacturing, logistics and distribution, etc. So look at things from that user's perspective and go, do they really need this? Am I over engineering, over designing this? Am I really providing value to them? By the way, you might have to add tasks to make sure that you're providing value. Then the team can prioritize where and when to apply changes in the future state using the findings. And that's part of what we'll talk about in the findings document. So let's talk about the process for doing value stream mapping. So an overview of the process. You do the initial map using one of the 2 styles. And that whole thing includes a lot of discovery. So you're going to do a current state map in one of the two styles. You're going to identify issues and then also identify the metrics. That's something I haven't talked about. How do we want to measure this? How are we, if it's order entry, what's the order entry accuracy? If it's really order fulfillment, to take a larger process, the concept of a perfect order. How often do we deliver on time, the right process, no defects, etc. So what are the metrics? How do we want to measure this process? And how are we doing, right? So you want to document all that. And then we do a findings, what we call a findings document, which has, as I said, do-its, events, and projects. Again, I'll talk about this in a little more detail. Basically, each one of those gets more and more complex, as you might guess. So do-its are things you do right away. Events are things that take a little more work, and projects are projects, right? And need an ROI and deeper resources. So you take kind of the findings, you review those with the team, and you build, as you can, a future state map, or you build a series of initiatives to get to a future state, but you want to have a vision of what that future state's going to look like. So that's the overview of the process. Talk about the current state map. There are sometimes we go into clients, I've gone into clients, and a lot of functions are well documented. Sometimes they were well documented 5 years ago, and that's not how the process works now. But to the extent you can leverage off documentation, do that. But in many cases, things just are not well documented, or documented in the manner one of these two techniques employs. Realize that many functional areas support several services without clear boundaries. That's one of the things to look for. That's one of the things with that horizontal, vertical band that can get highlighted, vertical band. Work to identify what the true value for the customer and the product are as you're working through the current state map. And just another little note, a lot of administrative processes, sometimes that's harder to see. And that's, review and audit. It gets more entrenched and hidden, but work to call that out, work to call out, auditing internal processes, administrative processes. Make sure you documented them. So continuing with the current state map, we feel very strongly, and it's everybody's, you want key players in these sessions. Their time is precious. And so we look to complete each one of these phases in a day. So current state map, we want to complete a map in a day. So we scope the process to that objective, right? So let's take order fulfillment. You can do order fulfillment, but I mean, if you're a manufacturer, and especially a complex manufacturer, your whole manufacturing scheduling process, you can't do that and do order fulfillment, manufacturing scheduling, logistics, etc., transportation, etc., all in one day. So you need to break out some of those. So scope it for one day. I mentioned this, to have a cross-functional team of knowledgeable doers. It's often the middle managers, typically people who have worked in their functional area for quite a while. But you want people who will be responsible for implementing change, and will be change agents to some extent. Although I will say, you can also have people who are new to the company. Sometimes those are really good people who have experience in their area, but are new to the company, so they're going to bring a different perspective in. Often good to incorporate them. And sometimes the people you put on a team are extremely knowledgeable, but aren't necessarily change agents. That's okay. It's important to have them on the team as well. So again, at the end of the day, you want a picture of what the team sees when following the product and service, and all the observations the team makes. So I talked about the findings document. Findings document are the observations we gather along the way. And it's developed by and reviewed by the team. So It's gathered as part of the first stage session, then documented by whoever's running the session, and then reviewed by the team as part of often building the future state map, but reviewed by the team typically the next day. Findings include action items. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about this do-its thing. So do-its are actions that can be taken immediately to improve the process. We'll look at a couple examples. Events are actions that require some analysis and some cost to implement, but they're not really resource intensive, and they're typically more localized in effect, right? Realize there's shades of gray between these, right? So it's not important to get these exactly, but the breakout is important in terms of what actions are taken after the session. And projects are things where you've got really teams that requires teamwork across function, more in-depth analysis, and enough cost to really require some kind of cost-benefit analysis. Speaking of cost-benefit analysis, the data you gather in terms of time and resource for each activity will help show the potential ROI as you're going along. And then another thing in the findings document is open issues that address broader policy and cultural issues. So we often include those as part of the findings document. And the classic example for me, and I've run into this, I don't know how many times, especially since a lot of my work has been with privately held mid-sized companies, is, you know, a classic policy is the customer's always right, and we will do whatever it takes for any order, which includes allowing changes to orders really up until the time they're picked or even when they're being picked. So some of the policies like that, teams frequently will bring up and really need to be addressed as a policy issue. What really is our policy on order changes? You know, is there, and what are the exceptions? What are the reasons for the exceptions? So formalizing that often helps processes run much more efficiently. That's not a direct process issue. You're not going to change anything in the process for that, but you need to gather that kind of open issue and address it as part of this work. So talking a little bit more about the findings document, one methodology we use will document points in the process. That's those little numbers I showed you on one of the flowcharts that aren't value add. Call them disconnect, and those are bullet points. So disconnects are part of the process of going from a present to a future state using this concept of disconnects. And then they provide a starting point for do-its, events, and projects and requirements for the future state. So I'll give you two examples. One disconnect in one client was the receipt in the warehouse, that separate warehouse management system in the process I showed earlier in the process map does not flow consistently into a receipt in NAV. Clearly a problem in the process. So that means you couldn't, that actually meant the customer service people didn't trust the inventory that was in NAV, right? Obvious disconnect, obvious issue in the process. So we just said, this is an event, you need to, they were already looking into this, but you need to look into this. So this isn't a do it. This is going to take a little while. This isn't you walk out of the session and go fix something. It's going to take a little while, but we didn't feel it was a whole process, right? There's obviously something in they hadn't found the root cause. There's something in the interface between the systems that's not working right. So have warehousing, planning, purchasing, and IT find out what the root cause is and fix it, basically. That's an example of a disconnect, and then what an event would mean as opposed to a do it or a project. This wasn't a project. Another disconnect, and this is the one I mentioned, is they had no visibility into future demand. So when there were, this is for purchasing, when they're planning to purchase products, particularly for stock products, they really didn't have any visibility into future demand, but also demand for new product launches, which they were doing, and marketing campaigns. That was all tribal knowledge. You know, somebody happened to know something was going to happen. So that obviously creates a lot of difficulties for purchasing and planning. The recommendation of the team and the recommendation coming out of that disconnect is start a project to scope and implement demand planning and forecasting. So hopefully that gives some idea about what's meant by a disconnect and how that's documented and how it gets documented as part of the process mapping. And then in the findings documents, actions to be taken to correct these disconnects and process problems. So we talked about the future state map, again, completed in the day with the same team, right? Shouldn't change teams, it should be the same team. The ideal is to create a flexible, reactive system that adapts to changing customer needs. Eliminate waste, minimize the handoffs in those silos, functional silos, and trigger resources only when you need them. And again, the note I kind of talked about this is, from my point of view and my experience, is that future state evolves, particularly as events and projects are worked through. And I'll go back to the events and projects I noted in the previous slide. A project about demand management, that could be a 6-month project, possibly even more, right? So there's a lot of things that client could do, like the do it that was mentioned, the disconnect between the warehouse management system receipts and what went into NAV. Go fix that right away, right? That'll improve the process. But implementing a demand management system is a whole other thing. And until you decide the software that you're going to use, et cetera, how you're going to do it, you can't really draw the full future state map, but you can make a note that the future state will include that. So future state is something that evolves, and typically what I've seen is sometimes over a year or more from these mapping sessions. So a little more just kind of down to earth, some meeting rules. I've done a lot, been trained in facilitation, done a lot of facilitation over the years. And this is the standard thing I post on a flip chart when I'm doing any kind of meeting, managing any kind of meeting. One of the rules is everyone is equal, which means you bring people in, and whoever is running the meetings needs to enforce this. You'll have people of different level. It might be a lot of middle managers, but it could be somebody more senior. It might be somebody who works out on the warehouse floor, you know, somebody who's picking, and because of their depth of knowledge of what happens in the warehouse, you know, they're brought in. Doesn't matter. Everybody should be in there because of what they can contribute, their knowledge of the process, and what they can contribute. So all kind of hierarchy is gone in these sessions. Like I said when I quoted Duran at the start of this, focus on the process, not the person. Don't have people talk about, you know, well, Harvey or Bob always screws this up. That doesn't matter. There's a reason Bob's screwing it up. It's because he doesn't have enough information. Great, that's the process, but focus on the process. Be specific, give examples. Don't say, oh, this always happens. One of the key things when you're doing this kind of work is also dig out how frequently something happens. It's not unusual for to hear when you're going through a process that, well, we've got, you know, this type of order that we're processing. And this type of order requires all this logic and all these exceptions. Find out how often the exceptions work. Don't just say, oh, this happens frequently or whatever. Be specific. Don't design a process around something that happens every 6 months. Design a process around things that happen with enough frequency to really design the process to handle the exceptions. So always be specific. Limit war stories. I always joke that this applies more to the consultant if you're using one than to the people on the team. But don't try and be efficient in running the meeting. Don't let people get into long stories about how something evolved or whatever. Some just basic rules in terms of running any kind of meeting, one conversation at a time. Try to enforce that. Another rule I call the 2-second rule, which is like the one conversation at a time, but a little different. It's a listening rule. Try to let somebody finish what they're saying, count 1001, 1002 before you respond. So don't just jump, listen enough so you respond properly. And then this is always the most widely adopted rule. In my experience, I always call it the 5-minute rule. Often teams will start talking about an issue, circle around the issue, etc. And so after 5 minutes, it's anybody, whether the person running the meeting, anybody in the session, call a 5-minute rule. Drive the discussion to conclusion, or put it on a flip chart as an open issue. And then at the session, decide how to handle the open issue. Quite often you'll find out that you've actually resolved the issue in other discussion, but don't let things go on. I've had various clients adopt this rule. Almost everybody adopts this rule if they're not using some form of it in meetings. One client called it the rat hole rule, and the team members took a lot of glee in calling rat hole out just to stop useless kind of circular discussion. So that's an important rule. And the most obvious one is a little blocked off, but just mobile devices off, laptops closed during the workshop. Again, you're trying to get a lot of work done in a day, so everything you can do to focus that work. So what are the tools of the trade? I mean, how do you do this? And I will say, actually, a number of years ago, I've used some relatively sophisticated software to try and do this using software. I threw that away. I mean, it gets in the way, frankly. This is keep it simple. So get a large room with a lot of wall space. And enough chairs for everybody in the team. Get the posted flip charts. I mean, if you don't want to get posted flip charts, they're just easy to use because you don't have to tape them up on a wall. They don't take paint off the wall. So use posted flip charts. Get some 3x5 or post-it notes large enough to write those activity boxes and any other notes you want to use. Get markers, for writing on the post-it notes. Just a few little side notes. The post-it notes you're going to use for, again, you're going to create each one of those activities. You can turn a post-it note on its side for a decision box. Post-it notes, even the ones that are exceptionally sticky, often fall off a flip chart. At the end of the day, you're going to take that flip chart and document it all in Visio. So I should actually add cellophane tape. Once you've actually decided that the post-it note is where it should be, tape it, once you're done with the day, tape all those post-it notes on the chart, because when you pull them down, take them back to your office or a hotel room or whatever to document things, you don't want to have all these notes having fallen off and you can't remember where they went. The reason, by the way, to use post-it notes and not just write things on the flip chart is things move along. This process will evolve as you start documenting it. So where maybe there wasn't a decision detail or some other detail in the chart, people go back and go, oh gosh, we forgot this. And then you have to move all the notes around. So just stay flexible, keep it simple, use some markers, etc. So that is the overview of value stream mapping and the process. Let me know if you've got any questions. I do actually have a findings document which I can pull up, but I kind of explained what that is, but we can look at that a little bit if anybody feels it's necessary. So Angie, we're about 40 minutes in. You want to, any questions? Open it up to questions.
Thank you, Bob. No, it appears that we do not have any questions for you at this time, but if anyone does have any, please feel free to get those typed in and we can get those addressed. Or if you want to contact us directly, you can. Bob's information is up, so if you want to contact him, that's fine, or you can give us a call. The 800 number is 800-834-7700. So we look forward to hearing from you and discussing the issues that you are facing.
Great, thanks.
All right, well, thank you, Bob, again for presenting, and to everyone on today's call, or if you are watching on demand, thank you for joining us. And we do have more webinars coming soon. This afternoon, we have Marlene Mankin from Innovia Consulting, and she's going to be presenting on how to update shortcut dimension data using configuration worksheets. That's on Rapid Start. And then next Tuesday, August 20th, we have Kevin Clifford from Innovia Consulting, and he's going to be presenting on PopDoc. What is it? So check out our website for more of our upcoming events, and that's innovia.com/events. And we also want to mention that we have our new podcast going on. It's called the Innovia Conversation. And you can find out about all the different podcast platforms that you can listen to on our podcast page. And that's innovia.com/podcast. So check those out and subscribe to get the notifications on all of our new episodes. And Innovia is proud to be a platinum sponsor of BCUG NAVUG Summit in Orlando, Florida this year. The dates are October 13th through the 18th, and if you haven't already registered or if you want more information about Summit, check out our conference page on our website, and that's innovia.com/conferences. All right, thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on another Innovia webinar. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks.